Hello there, welcome to the video. So in this video, we will understand the core architectural concepts of Azure. We'll understand what is a resource group, subscription and management groups. We'll also understand what is an Azure region and what are availability zones. So to start with, resources are basically the basic building blocks of your architecture in Azure. Resources are instances of services that you create. So a resource can be a virtual machine which you create in Azure, or you create a storage account, you create an SQL database, you create a Cosmos DB instance. All these are resources which you create in your Azure account. Then what is a resource group? A resource group is nothing but it is a logical grouping of the resources. So resources are combined into resource groups, which acts as a logical container into which Azure resources like web apps or databases or storage accounts are deployed and managed. So you can say resource group is a collection of resources. It is a logical grouping of resources in your Azure account. Then a subscription. Subscription is one level up the hierarchy from resource groups. You use subscriptions to manage multiple resource groups. So a subscription groups together user accounts and the resources that have been created by those user accounts. And for each subscription you have in your Azure account, there are limits or quotas to the amount of resources that you can create in that particular subscription. So organizations use subscription to manage costs and the resources that are created by users, teams, or projects. So in your Azure account, you can have multiple subscriptions. Each subscription will have some limit to the number of resources which you can create of a particular type in your subscription. And you can use subscriptions to manage costs. So each subscription, you get a bill generated for one subscription. So you can manage costs by using subscriptions as well. What is a management group? Management groups basically helps you manage subscriptions. So if in your Azure account you have multiple subscriptions, a management group is one level up the hierarchy from subscriptions, and they are used to manage your subscription. So you can manage accesses, you can manage policies and compliance for your subscriptions. So all subscriptions in a management group automatically inherit the conditions applied to the management group. This is very important, that you apply an access policy to a management group, and the same access policy will be applicable to all the subscriptions which are within that management group and to all the resources which are within those subscriptions. So this is the hierarchy. You can see here that management groups sit at the top. With one management group, you manage multiple subscriptions. With one subscription, you manage either one or multiple resource groups. And within one resource group, you can have multiple resources. You can also have multiple management groups as well. So now let us see what are Azure regions, availability zones, and region pairs. Resources. So what is a resource? We understood a resource is the most basic entity which you can create in an Azure account. So resources are basically created in regions. Okay, and what are regions? They are different geographical locations around the globe that contain Azure data centers. So in the previous slide, we understood that a resource is created within a resource group, which means that resource group is a logical grouping of resources. But that is just a logical grouping. Okay, actually these resources are created in physical locations, physical geographical locations. So if you are creating a VM, that VM will be hosted, that VM instance will be created in a physical geographical location, and these different geographical locations around the globe are called regions, and these regions have data centers. So Azure is made up of data centers located around the globe. Okay, a region is a geographical area on the planet, okay, that contains at least one, but potentially multiple data centers that are nearby and networked together with a low latency network. So if we see this slide here, we can see these are all the regions of Azure in the entire geography. So you can see that there are regions in South Africa North, South Africa West, South India, Central India, West India. So in all these regions, there are a set of n number of data centers which Azure has. And in these data centers, the resources are actually created whenever you create a resource in Azure. When you deploy a resource in Azure, you'll often need to choose the region where you want your resource to be deployed. So if you're creating a virtual machine, you need to choose a region where that virtual machine will be deployed. Okay. There are some services, there are some resources which do not need a region to be assigned. Like there are some global services for which you don't need to assign a region specifically, but for most of the services you need to assign a region. Okay, and there is also another point that it so happens that there are slight differences in the properties of the services which are offered in all these different regions. So when you're creating a virtual machine, okay, so and if you want to select the type or the size of the virtual machine, so certain sizes might not be available in certain regions. So that sort of specification is also there. Then it mentions that okay, so this Microsoft website mentions that Azure has more global regions than any other cloud provider. Fine. So those regions give you flexibility. So why regions are important? They give you flexibility because then they bring the applications closer to your users, no matter where they are. So if you have a web application which caters to users across the world, which has users in say Africa, India, Brazil, America, so you can deploy your resources in all these different regions so that your application is closer to the users, and it also provides the benefit of low latency. Okay, then global regions also provide better scalability and redundancy as well. Then there are some specific types of regions in US and in China, which are basically they are so regions which are in some of the regions which are in US. They are physical and logical network isolated instances of Azure for US government agencies and partners. Okay, these data centers are operated by screened US personnel and include additional compliance certifications. So there are some specific government specific regions also which are provided by Azure. So that is for the US and China. Now, say you want to ensure that your services and your data are redundant so that they are available even if there is some failure has happened. So you can protect your information in case of failure. So Azure helps you make your application and your data highly available through availability zones. Okay. So availability zones, what are availability zones? They are physically separate data centers within an Azure region. Okay. So each availability zone is made up of one or more data centers equipped with independent power, cooling, and networking. So what we understood earlier is in a region in Azure, there will be a set of data centers, multiple data centers. Okay. But within the same Azure region, there can be separate, physically separate data centers, which are called availability zones. So one availability zone is a physical location in a region, which can have one or multiple data centers. And these data centers are equipped with their independent power, cooling, and networking. So an availability zone is set up to be an isolation boundary. If one zone gets down, the other continues working. Availability zones are connected through high-speed private fiber optic networks. Okay, so availability zones are primarily created to provide redundancy and availability for your applications. So there is a minimum of 3 zones within a single region. And point to be noted that not all the regions have availability zones. Some regions have availability zones. Some regions do not have availability zones. Okay. So if a region is having say 3 availability zones, which means that that particular region has 3 separate physical locations, okay, which are distant from each other. And in these 3 separate physical locations, there are one or more than one data centers which are located. Okay. So you use availability zones to run your mission critical applications and to build high availability into your application architecture by co-locating your compute, storage, networking, and data resources within a zone and replicating in other zones. So you can, if you are using a particular region, okay, to host your website, what you can do, you can replicate all the resources in two different availability zones within the same region. So this provides redundancy and high availability to your application architecture. So this is a diagram which depicts an Azure region and multiple availability zones in that Azure region, and each availability zone has one or more than one data center. Now, availability zones are primarily for virtual machines, managed disks, load balancers, and SQL databases. So these are the kind of services which you usually create in a zone redundant fashion. Like you will usually create a virtual machine in 2 or 3 different zones in the same region, okay, because it needs high availability. Same goes with a load balancer or a SQL database or a managed disk. So Azure services that support availability zones fall into 2 categories. So these are the type of services, okay, like VMs, managed disk, load balancer, and SQL databases which support availability zones. So there are some services which are called zonal services, which means you can pinpoint and you can say that, okay, I want to create this service or this resource in this particular zone. It could be a VM or a managed disk or an IP address. Then there are some zone redundant services, okay, which means that the platform will automatically replicate those services across zones. So these are, says you are creating a zone redundant storage, which means that your storage will automatically be replicated across different availability zones in the same region. Okay, so each Azure region is always paired with another region within the same geography. So and these are like at least 300 miles away. So these are called paired regions. So this paired region approach allows for replication of resources across a geography that helps reduce the likelihood of interruptions because of events such as natural disasters, civil unrest, power outages, or physical network outages. So you can say that for every region in Azure, there will be a paired region, okay, within the same geography. So say, for example, if there is a region in India, it could happen that Central India is a paired region with South India. Okay, it is within the same geographical boundary, like it is in India. It won't go outside that geographical boundary. So what will happen is that when one region goes down, which is paired with another region in the same geographical boundary, then the services would automatically fail over to the other region in its region pair. So this helps whenever there is a kind of a disaster that an entire region went down because of, say, a civil unrest or some natural calamity or some power outages or anything like that. Now, because the pair of regions is directly connected and far enough apart to be isolated from regional disasters, you can use them to provide reliable services and data redundancy. So that is the main point here, that they are far enough to be isolated from regional disasters. Okay. Now, examples of region pairs in Azure are West US paired with East US and Southeast Asia paired with East Asia. So these are region pairs. They have to be in the same geographical boundary. There is one region pair which goes across geographical boundary. I think it's Brazil and US. That's the only exception. Now let us understand more about resources and resource groups. So a resource, we understood that a resource is a manageable item that's available through Azure. Okay, so a resource is like you create a virtual machine, storage account, web application, database, virtual network. These are all examples of resources. A resource group, we understand that it is a container for related resources for an Azure solution. So resource group is a logical container of resources. Okay, so it includes resources that you want to manage as a group. You decide which resources belong in a resource group based on what makes the most sense for your organization. So for your organization, for your application architecture, you can decide that what resources will go into one resource group. So a resource can only be a member of a single resource group. It can't be a member of 2 different resource groups. A resource group can't be nested. Okay, you can't create a resource group and then you put that resource group in another resource group. That's not possible. And before you create any resource in Azure, you need a resource group for that. That's a prerequisite. So what are the main criterias for creating a resource group, or what are the main points? So one is logical grouping. By placing resources of similar usage, type, or location in a resource group, you can provide order and organization to resources you create in Azure. So this is one way in which you can group similar resources together. It's logical grouping. You can group them in a resource group based on their usage, type, or location. Or you can group resources based on their life cycle in a resource group. So if you delete a resource group, all the resources contained within that resource group are also deleted. So organizing resources by life cycle can be useful in, say, non-production environments where you might try an experiment and then dispose of it. Another criteria could be authorization, where you can create resource groups. So you can assign role-based access control at the resource group level, and that access control will be applicable to all the resources inside that resource group. So resource groups are also a scope for applying role-based access control. You can apply this role-based access control permission at the group level, and by applying RBAC permissions to a resource group, you can ease administration and limit access to allow only what's needed. Using Azure requires an Azure subscription. So till now, these are the few criteria based on which you can group your resources within a resource group. Now, resource groups are managed by Azure subscriptions. So using Azure requires you to create a subscription. You cannot use Azure without a subscription. A subscription provides you with authenticated and authorized access to Azure products and services. An Azure subscription is a logical unit of Azure services that links to an Azure account, which is an identity in Azure Active Directory or in a directory that Azure AD trusts. So your subscription will link to an Azure account, which provides the authentication for you to use whatever services you want to use within your subscription. So one account can have one subscription, or it can have multiple subscription. Say, for example, you are trying out Azure. So you will create your account in Azure, and you will have to create a subscription for yourself before you can create any resource. So your one account can have either one resource, or it can have multiple resources. Okay. And one more thing to remember is that each subscription will have a different bill generated. Okay. So multiple subscriptions that have different billing models and to which you apply different access management policies. So now there are two types of subscription boundaries that you can use. So till now, I think we are clear that a subscription is kind of a usage boundary. Okay. And to create any resource or to use Azure, you have to create a subscription. Your subscription is associated with your account, with your Azure account. And you can create one subscription, you can create multiple subscriptions, and each subscription will have a different billing model. And at each subscription level, you can have different access management policies. So now there are two types of subscription boundaries. One is billing boundary. So this type of a subscription type determines how an Azure account is billed for using Azure. You can create multiple subscriptions for different types of billing requirements. Azure generates separate billing reports and invoices for each subscription so that you can organize and manage costs. So this is one way of creating a subscription. This could be one criteria that you want to differentiate the billing models, okay, for two different organizations or two different departments in your organization. So in that case, you will create two different subscriptions so that you can manage your billing in a better manner. Another way is another mode is for access control boundary. So Azure applies access management policies at the subscription level, and you can create separate subscriptions to reflect different organizational structures. So you can create subscriptions to reflect the org structure in your company or in your organization. An example is that within a business, you have different departments to which you apply distinct Azure subscription policies. So one is, say, for every department, if you want a separate bill to be generated, then you can create one subscription for each department. And similarly, for each department, you need to have separate access control boundaries, separate access management policies. Then you create separate subscriptions for that. So basically, you create additional subscriptions for manage and setting up separate environments for development, testing, and production. That is one use case for creating separate subscriptions. You can create subscriptions to reflect different organizational structures. For example, you could limit a team to lower cost resources while allowing the IT department a full range. So this is an example where you create subscriptions to reflect your organizational structure. Then you can create different subscriptions for billing purposes to manage your billing better. Okay. Also, you can create different subscriptions to manage your limits, because each subscription has a limit or quota assigned to the number of resources you can create. Say, for an example, in a subscription or in a subscription, you will have a limit to the number of VMs you can create. So to manage the limits, you can create additional subscriptions. Now, if your organization has many subscriptions, then you need a way to manage all these subscriptions, right? So you might need a way to efficiently manage access policies and compliance for those subscriptions. Azure Management Group provides a level of scope above subscriptions. So managing subscriptions, it is done by Azure Management Groups. It is a level up in the hierarchy, and it is used to manage access policies and compliance for the subscriptions. So you organize subscriptions into containers called management groups and apply your governance conditions to the management groups. So here you can see, first we can just have a look at the diagram, that there is a management group. This is again a there is a root management group. Then there are other management groups for different departments in your organization, like human resource management group, IT management group, marketing management group. And this root management group is having 2 different subscriptions, and marketing management group is having another 2 different subscriptions. And this IT management group is having another management group called production, and then so on and so forth. So one management group can have multiple management groups below it, and within those management groups, you can have multiple subscriptions. So why it is important? Because Azure allows you to apply policies like access policies, okay, at the management group level. So that, and those access policies or compliance policies which you apply at the management group level, those policies are applicable to all the other subscriptions or all the other management groups which fall under the root management group in the hierarchy. Okay, so you can apply policies to a management group that limits the regions available for VM creation. Say, for example, you have a use case that whenever you are creating a VM, you should restrict the users to create, or you should restrict your developers that they can create VMs only in India region. So you can do that. You can apply policies to a management group that limits the regions available for VM creation. This policy would be applied to all management groups, subscriptions, and resources under that management group by only allowing VMs to be created in that region. Another scenario would be where you would use management groups to provide user access to multiple subscriptions. Okay, so by moving multiple subscriptions under that management group, you can create one role-based access assignment on the management group level, which will inherit that access to all the subscriptions below it. So these are 2 examples where you should use management groups, and what are the benefits of using management groups to manage your subscriptions. So yeah, so this is what I wanted to cover in this video. Thank you for watching it, and continue your learning. Thank you.